Mto Congo, also known as the mighty Congo River, has long been a lifeline for various civilizations across time as it carves its way through the heart of Central West Africa, where it has been associated with three nations: the Republic of Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and one that no longer exists, the Kingdom of Kongo. But why? How does a nation that once thrived on trade, diplomacy, and military strength disappear from the map? How did a land of wealth and ambition spiral into chaos, betrayal, and collapse? This is the story of the Kingdom of Kongo, a tale of power, survival, and the dangerous dance of empire. The Congo Basin has been home to various human groups since the dawn of modern humanity. They subsisted by foraging the forests around them for fruits, nuts, and mushrooms, and other small games when the opportunity presented itself. Over the millenniums, some hundreds of kilometers away, another group began to develop. These were the Bantu-speaking people. They enjoyed rearing small livestock, farmed grains and tree crops, and also took delight in fishing. These two groups were separated by the thick, dense forests of the Congo Basin, which kept the Bantu-speaking people out and the Congolese hunter-gatherers in. But all this would change between 2000 and 1500 BCE, when a significant climatic shift occurred, as the strong African monsoon weakened, bringing in less rainfall into the region. This reduction in rainfall caused the Congo Basin to shrink, transforming parts of its dense forests into open pockets of savanna. These newly formed clearings allowed the Bantu-speaking people to migrate southward, following the rivers into areas that were previously occupied by the early forest dwellers. By 500 BCE, the Bantu had fully settled these open pockets, outcompeting and displacing the original inhabitants. The societies that were formed by the Bantu-speaking people were primarily farming-based, as they practiced long fallow agriculture. In this system, they would clear a piece of land and farm on it until the soil was no longer fertile. Then pack up their bags, burn their shelters, which are made from cheap materials, then move to another piece of land, clear it, and start the process all over again. This frequent relocation prevented the development of landholding rights, as people were not attached to specific plots of land. As time passed, some of these villages began to exploit the environment to produce a few high-quality products that will eventually become the basis of industries like the high-luxury textile and copper trade the region will be known for in later centuries. For now, they crafted items like bark cloth, which were widely used for everyday purposes and could be traded with neighboring villages. This trade between communities expanded in scale and complexity between 700 and 1000 BCE. We saw them develop systems to oversee and coordinate agricultural production from planting to harvesting. This gave them time to plan out which goods to produce for trade. This level of planning meant that their societies underwent a significant transformation from an egalitarian one to a stratified society, complete with an elite ruling class. One way this transformation from an egalitarian to a stratified society manifested itself in Central Africa was through the belief that extraordinary success or failure of a settlement depended for the most part on their ability to control mystical forces, which was just knowing what farming methods worked best or which herbs could heal or kill you. These things may seem, simple and mundane to me and you right now, but it took humans thousands of years to figure these things out. The people who mastered this knowledge became influential, with some of them using it for personal power and others using it for the community's benefit. One interesting fact about this time period is that the ruling class often claimed that their power knowledge of the mystical forces was given to them by a conquering chief or by a god. They did this to improve social cohesion, as expansion was the name of the game for ambitious leaders who grew their centers through hostile takeovers or peaceful mergers. As I mentioned earlier, land wasn't the most valuable resource in Central Africa. It was people. They were needed to grow food, make goods, or serve as slaves. By the 9th century, some well-established centers began to pop up around Lake Mai-Ndombe, Malepo Pool, Fetila Chuya, and the Mpemba Depression. These centers will eventually give birth to some of the earliest kingdoms in the region. Fortunately for my sanity, we are not covering all the civilizations that emerged in and around the Congo River. Instead, we'll focus on one, one named after the river itself, the Kingdom of Kongo. Thanks to letters that were sent between the Portuguese and Congolese crown, we have a good idea of how the Kingdom of Kongo was founded. To set the stage, by the end of the 13th century, the region of West Central Africa was a patchwork of federated polities. Amongst them were the 7 kingdoms of Congo da Ilana in the far west, Mpemba in the south, and Vungun to the east. One day, a man from Kombia, whose real name has been lost to history, but is remembered as Motino Bene, or the True King, decided he wanted more from life. Motivated by ambition, he gathered a group of like-minded and restless men to fight under his banner for Vungun. Leading his forces, Motino Bene crossed the Congo River and launched an invasion into Mpembe, where he successfully captured Mpembe Kasi, a major settlement of the region, and made it his capital. From here, he continued his campaign against Mpembe and the 7 kingdoms. At some point, they were able to establish dominance over the valley of the Kiwili River, which allowed them to establish military bases in the forest and the natural rock formations. These strategic positions created choke points that allowed them to control and tax the trade that flowed through the region. By 1375, a descendant of Motino Bene, Nzinga, had become the ruler of Vungun and the Nuksiku region, and went in marriage alliance with the House of Bata, the ruling house of the Kingdom of Mbata. Fast forward to 1380, Nzinga's wife would give birth to a son called Lukeni Lu Nimi. Lukeni, continuing the missions of his ancestors, decided to focus his efforts on Mpemba. Just like his father, he forged a new alliance with Kambunga and Impangala, which granted him more access into Mpemba and allowed him to establish a new base at the foot of Mount Mungo da Congo. From here, he entered a marriage alliance with Vunda, similar to the one his father had entered with Mbata. With this alliance, Lukeni merged Mpemba, Vunda, and the region of the Nzinga Valley, and then slowly absorbed the rest of Mpemba to form a new kingdom called Congo. Congo's capital was called Mbanza Congo, situated on the flat top of Mount Mungo da Congo. From here, the kingdom will effectively control the flow of trade and project power into the region, just like he and his father were able to do from Mpemba Kasi. Early Congo, as we have seen, was more or less founded through alliances rather than military conquest, which meant some power-sharing agreements and compromises were made. For one, the early kingdom was somewhat of a co-regency, with Mbata having as much power as Mbanza Congo. Mbata was an autonomous region that had the power to vote on who the next king of Congo would be, a special status that was also given to Vunda. Congo kept expanding even as it was being formed, this time relying more on his military might to conquer the regions of Kandongo and Nsundi, governing these regions as royal holdings under the direct control of the royal family. A Mawene, which loosely translates to lord or governor, was appointed by the king to govern and generate revenue for the crown. He oversaw a cluster of provinces and sub-provinces all the way down to a village. Their appointment was reviewed every 3 years based on their efficiency to generate revenue. To visualize this system, you can think of the Mawene as renting the provinces from the king, and the money that they generate from the activities, either by taxing or farming, was used to pay rent to the king. If they didn't pay enough, the rigs being replaced. This fear kept them in line and ensured that they sent regular payments called renders to the king. Some royal women like the queen's mother or sisters, also received renders from this domain. They could even be appointed as Mawene themselves. During times of war, these women often ruled the kingdom while the king was away. These royal women were part of a group called the matrons, who quietly held lots of power. They only stepped into the limelight during leadership crises, making decisions behind the scenes most of the time. The revenue generated from these new domains fueled Congo's war effort to become one of the largest polities in the region by the end of the 15th century. At this point, Lukene had long passed away and was succeeded by 2 of his cousins, then his son, Nkungu Anititu. The kingdom was strong as ever. as it had just incorporated a new domain called Soyo, which would be the site for an important event that would open our young kingdom to the world. Stories and myths of the River of Gold, the kingdom of Pastor John, or the riches of people like Massa Musa, sent Europe into a frenzy to find and make contact with these mysterious kingdoms that were awash with gold. European kingdoms sent hundreds of explorers to make deals and alliances with these African kingdoms, pushing the age of exploration into full gear. Portugal began charting the coast of West Africa around 1440, having made contact with the Kingdom of Benin and Fanten kingdoms in 1472 and 1471 respectively. These kingdoms were incredibly wealthy and powerful, and with Portugal finding it necessary to protect its monopoly on the gold trade, it built the fort of São José in 1482, which allowed Portugal to have a fleet present in the Gulf of West Africa. By midsummer of 1482, Captain Diego Cao was selected to lead an expedition south of the equator for King Charles II of Portugal. By August of the same year, he came up to the mouth of the Congo River and erected a stone pillar, claiming all the land for Charles II. They sailed up the river to discover natives with whom they were able to establish communication and trade. The natives told the explorers the tales of the great king who lived further up the river. Diego dispatched 4 men to look for and establish contact with the great king the natives had told him about. After some few days, with Diego growing tired of waiting for his men to return, he just took, or the more technical term, kidnapped the natives who boarded his ship and brought them back with him to Lisbon. He arrived in the Portuguese capital on the 8th of April 1484. The Congolese natives were taught Portuguese, while the Franciscan priest from Diego's party was able to learn the Kilo-Congo language. The Portuguese natives were treated to the best hospitality Portugal could afford. The reports of Diego's expedition prompted an official invitation to Congo in 1487. When the ship that came to chauffeur the Congolese delegation arrived, they found out that the 4 Portuguese men who were left behind were also treated to the highest standards of Congo's royal hospitality, with the 2 kingdoms only having positive reports of each other. A delegation of Congolese ambassadors with an escort of nobles bearing gifts for Charles II was received at the church of the Leotos, where they were introduced to Christianity and shown around Portugal. The delegation will return to Congo in 1491, bringing news of the wonder and power of Portugal. I need to add here that Congo at this point wasn't some backwater that could be scoffed at or, saw Portugal as a pinnacle of development. Record from this time period mentions how Congo's productivity was equal to, if not higher than that of most of Europe, especially medieval Portugal. The returning Congolese delegation was escorted by Portugal's own delegation, with the intention to show Portuguese culture at its best, some soldiers to demonstrate Portugal's military capabilities, peasant families to introduce European farming methods and bread-making techniques, stonemasons and carpenters to improve house-building techniques, and some priests for, The Portuguese mission to Congo was successful beyond what they could have hoped for. Congo allowed the Portuguese community to be established in Soyo and in the capital, Mombasa, Congo. Trade relationships were also established, and as a result, the Mawene of Soyo converted to Catholicism. The King of Congo was also baptized and adopted the name Jao, establishing and declaring Catholicism as the state religion. The nobles who returned from Portugal tutored the newly converted ruling class on how to read and write Latin and speak Portuguese. This newfound friendship and alliance between 2 kingdoms that were separated by vast lands and ocean must have been something beautiful to see. But something perverted was also established. Not to overcomplicate things, Portugal provided technology and military assistance to Congo in exchange for, though not only, slaves. Some of these slaves were sent to plantations in the New World, and some were traded with the gold trading kingdoms on the west coast of Africa who needed more and more slaves to mine gold, which Portugal then used to expand its hold on the region. For Congo's part, its bolstered military might was used to conquer and expand the kingdom, which as a result produced more slaves, creating a positive feedback loop on the slave trade. Congo's newfound success was interpreted by its citizens and its neighbor as a manifestation of the king's power over, the mystical forces. And the source for this newfound power was believed to have been the king's new allies, the Portuguese, who were Christians, attracting widespread interest from far and near and expanded the reach of the king's influence. The spread of Christianity, however, faced resistance in faraway regions of the kingdom and neighbouring territories, leading to conflicts and expansion wars. By the end of Zhao I's reign, Congo had become somewhat of a Christian kingdom, with soil now being added as a new voting province. However, Zhao I would denounce Christianity and purge the capital of Catholic priests around 1495. Many of these priests found refuge in Mvemba and Nzinga, the Mawene of Nzinga, who had spent much of his childhood studying with the king's Portuguese priests and advisors. When Zhao I died in 1509, Afonso's mother delayed the announcement of the king's death, giving Mvemba enough time to gather his supporters and seize the capital. He then confronted his traditionalist brother, Mpenzu Kintima, defeating him in a battle that Afonso framed as a struggle between the Haydens and the Christians for the soul of Congo. After his victory over his brother, he was crowned the 5th king of Congo, taking the name Afonso I. Afonso I envisioned Congo becoming a more powerful Catholic state as it relied too much on the generosity of the Portuguese crown for priests to perform his ceremonies and rites. Afonso wanted a more direct connection to Rome and sent his son Enrique to Europe to study to become a bishop. After many years of service, Enrique was ordained the Bishop of Utica on the 1st of December 1520. Afonso, wanting to fully realize his dream, wrote to Rome in 1526, donating the Church of Congo to Rome with the aim of it being established as an Episcopal see. In anticipation of his approval, Enrique moved to the Church of Congo to oversee its development. However, Portugal did not like this, as it did not want to lose its influence over Congo. It stalled, frustrated, and obstructed the plan. Enrique would pass away in 1531, leaving Congo without a Catholic official. In response, Portugal requested the Church of Congo be placed under the jurisdiction of the See of Sao Tome, further solidifying its control over Congo's Christianity. This event will add to a long list of frustration Afonso was beginning to have with the Portuguese. Militarily, I don't even know. Afonso found Portuguese help was practically useless for his goals to expand the kingdom. The Portuguese provided Congo with crossbows in 1491, which proved to be ineffective as the armies Congo faced did not use every cavalry, which the weapon was designed for. In 1509, the Portuguese again introduced muskets, which at that point was ineffective in battle due to their slow rate of fire. By 1514, Afonso tried incorporating Portuguese soldiers that were sent to him into his army and found that they were utterly incompetent as they allowed slaves that were captured to escape. On the trade side of things weren't any better. Portugal appointed Fernando de Molo as the captain of his royal factor in Sao Tome. He was responsible for enforcing Congo's monopoly on the slave trade and collecting taxes for merchants for the Portuguese crown. But de Molo was very greedy as he extorted the merchants and violated the Congolese crown's monopoly. Despite multiple complaints from Afonso and the Portuguese crown, de Molo remained a thorn to Afonso till his death in 1516. His interference in the slave trade had caused the Portuguese merchants to begin to source slaves from greedy nobles who kidnapped free Congolese to pass on as slaves. They also traveled into the interiors through the Kwanza River, where they came into contact with the region of Ambundu, a territory Congo claimed dominion over. The Ambundu region was settled between the 13th and 15th century. The region was divided into territories called Murundas, which were governed by leaders called Soba. Among these, the most powerful was Ndongo, who Soba held the title Angola Inene. By the time the Portuguese merchants arrived, the reigning Angola Inene was Ngola Kilwaje, whom in seeking to strengthen Ndongo and surpass the Kingdom of Kongo, established relationship with the Portuguese. However, this alliance was seen by Congo as a provocation, leading them to launch a war against the region. By 1520, Portugal sent a diplomatic mission to Ndongo to establish official ties, followed by another mission in 1525, which Afonso intercepted this time, claiming it was for their own protection. He also wrote to the Portuguese crown complaining that this trade with Ndongo was undermining his authority. Despite Afonso's objection, Portuguese trade with Ndongo continued unabated. Afonso would pass away in 1543 at the age of 87. The court was divided on who should be elected the next king, settling on one of Afonso's sons, Pedro I, who was crowned the 6th king of Congo. He reigned for only 3 years till Diego I, who was the grandson of Afonso I, launched a coup against his uncle, forcing him to seek refuge and asylum with the church. Not wanting to go down without a fight, Pedro I was able to rally the disgruntled nobles, and with the Portuguese and the Congo church on his side, he was certain he would win back the throne. But Diego tightened his grip on power by purging the kingdoms of Mawenes who were sympathetic to Pedro's cause. He arrested and executed all the royal knights of Congo, along with their families without trial. This level of brutality caused Pedro's plot to collapse on itself, as no one dared oppose Diego I. But one of the biggest challenges to Diego's rule was the church. The Jesuit priests who were sent to the kingdom in 1548 acted more like agents of the Bishop of Sao Tome. They collected tithes from the local Portuguese community and used these funds to buy and export slaves on behalf of the bishop. Additionally, they prioritized Portuguese and the church interest in the kingdom and played a crucial role in Pedro's plot to persuade the Pope to recognize Pedro I as the legitimate ruler of Congo. Diego retaliated by blocking the Jesuits' access to slaves, and with the Portuguese community in Congo completely loyal to Diego, they stopped paying tithes to the church. In 1555, these communities were granted the right to self-rule and chose to be ruled by Diego I, effectively becoming Congolese. Isolated and unable to maintain their influence, the Jesuits order withdrew all its priests from Congo in 1560. Switching gears to Ndongo, which Portuguese merchants continued to divert trade to, had interfered with Congo's expansion plan, which frustrated Diego I's efforts to annex the island of Luanda. In 1458, Diego I investigated the trade between the Portuguese merchants and the Kingdom of Ndongo. He found out that this trade was not only hurting Congo's interest, but also Portugal. Angola Kuluje of Ndongo realized Congo might take drastic action to stop its trade with the Portuguese merchants, especially after some Portuguese merchants were captured during Congo's campaign in Ludana. To further strengthen Ndongo's position, Kiluwaje sent emissaries to Portugal in 1549 to establish better ties. However, the Portuguese merchants, who were supposed to be his allies, sabotaged the mission, delaying the emissaries for 9 years in Sao Tome. By the time the Portuguese eventually sent their own representative to Ndongo in 1560, Kiluwaje had long died, and the new king was unimpressed with the Portuguese delegation, which only consisted of Jesuit priests and a guy called Paulo. The Jesuit priests in Ndongo found their missionary work to have been a disaster, but things were worse for Congo. Diego I would die in 1561, and his son Afonso II would become king, and then be deposed 28 days later by his brother Fernando I, who for the most part was satisfied with Ndongo, as long as they did not seek direct contact with Portugal. For the next 7 years, Fernando I was committed to annexing the luxurious textile-producing regions of Makoko that lay to the east of Matamba, where he was killed in battle in 1561. Enrique I, uncle to Fernando I, took over and continued Fernando's campaigns in the east and also met the same fate. Enrique's stepson, Álvaro I, was the great-grandson to Afonso I, was then crowned king. This marked the end of the Kulikeni dynasty and the beginning of the Kiwilu dynasty. At least that's the story Congo told to Rome. For the kingdom, the people had to write the records, and me and you watching the video had grown tired of the constant conflicts and bickering that happened around the king's election, which was becoming way too frequent. But Congo's troubles were far from over. Its ongoing campaigns on the Eastern Front had pushed the local population to their limits. Tired of Congo's constant warfare, these communities decided to rise up and fight back. The Jagas, whom the Portuguese and Congolese characterized as ferocious cannibalistic savage warriors from the region surrounding Makoko, began their invasion of Congo through Ntamba in 1568. They ravaged Mambanza Mbata as they headed towards Mambaza, Congo. Álvaro I, determined to forestall their incursion into the kingdom, engaged the Jagas in battle near the capital. He lost the battle and had to retreat to the highlands on the Congo River. From this position along the Congo River, Álvaro I reached out to King Sebastião I of Portugal for assistance. But seeing an opportunity to expand Portugal's influence in the region, Sebastião sent the governor of Sao Tome, Giovanni Sotomayor, in 1571 with a force of 600 soldiers. After 18 months of intense fighting, the Jagas were driven out of Congo, but the victory came at a steep price. Álvaro I was forced to sign a treaty of vassalage to Portugal. He also permitted the construction of a fort in Congo's capital and agreed to pay for Giovanni's services which included granting Giovanni a rent-bearing property, effectively giving him the status and privilege of a Mawene. Giovanni and Portugal, not surprisingly, also had their own agendas, which was to take control of the free Congo Portuguese population in Congo, and in Sebastiano's words,
reduce Congo to obedience.
at this point, it would be fair to call Alvaro a bum who lost the kingdom to Portugal, but he had plans to get it all back. First, with the help of Giovanni, he launched a counterattack in the Makoko region against the Jagas, winning and absorbing them into the kingdom. This victory finally gave him access to the luxurious textile industries that had long eluded the past three kings. With more resources at his disposal, Alvaro turned his attention to breaking the vassalage he had signed with Portugal. He renamed the capital city to São Salvador, following the Catholic traditions of naming cities after patron saints. In 1583, he dispatched Deontay Lobes, Congo's ambassadors to Spain and Portugal, with a letter donating Congo to the Holy See in exchange for freeing the kingdom from Portugal's claim. It took Lobes 6 years to accomplish his mission, as Portugal and Spain were stumbling blocks along the way. With Congo free from Portugal and Giovanni, Alvaro had one last mess to clean up. In 1571, Paulo des Novanis received the royal charter from Sebastiano I to establish a colony by conquering the Kingdom of Ndongo, a kingdom he had a contentious history with. Back in 1560, Paulo had led a diplomatic mission to Ndongo, only to be arrested and deported by King Njinga, who was under pressure from the Congo king Fernando I. Paulo arrived to the highlands off the coast of Ndongo in 1575, from where he was able to establish the small port of Nzele along the Kawanza River, marking the start of his mission. While all this was happening, things were changing in Ndongo. Angola Nkiluwaje had passed away, and power had shifted to Mwene Nlamba, who was chosen by Kiluwaje's court in what was essentially a political coup. Nlamba didn't hold power for long, as he was overthrown by Nkola Kilombo, who ruled the kingdom with an even hand at his control. Kilombo's harsh rule stirred unrest among the royal family and other factions who began to revolt against him. Desperate to maintain his grip on the kingdom, Kilombo invited Paulo des Novanis and his force to help crush the rebellion. This uneasy alliance continued to 1579, when Kilombo sent his army along Paulo's forces to suppress the rebellion. But along the way, things took a shocking turn as Kilombo's army turned on Paulo's forces and massacred them. The few Portuguese who survived fled back to Nkenze, where they were quickly besieged by Kilombo's force. In a surprising twist, local soldiers who were fed up with Kilombo's tyranny came to Paulo's aid, helping repel the attack and saving the remaining colonists. Paulo was now in a bad position. His forces had been depleted and his resources had run dry. Alvaro took this opportunity to pit two issues he had against each other. He offered assistance to Paulo to co-opt him into his invasion force of 60,000 men. If we're being realistic, it was probably 20,000, but Paulo declined Alvaro's offer to join the invasion as he wanted the full glory of conquering Ndongo. By May of 1580, Alvaro's army had advanced to the edge of Congo to begin the invasion of Ndongo, where it faced the mother of all logistical nightmares, getting 60,000 men across the river safely. With only a few boats available, the crossing was slow and disorganized, forcing the army to split into two smaller but vulnerable groups. This lack of coordination proved disastrous. As the first half of the army crossed, Ndongo's forces launched a swift and decisive attack, overwhelming them. The Congo soldiers panicked, broke ranks, and retreated in chaos. This crushing defeat not only altered the invasion, but also plunged Congo into decades of political instability. The defeat left Alvaro looking weak. Numerous factions that had been sidelined during his ascension were ready to turn on him at the slightest opportunity. Alvaro grew paranoid as he spent his last 7 years entangled in court politics. He died in 1587, with his son Álvaro II inheriting a kingdom on the verge of a civil war. Almost all the Mawene of Congo openly defied the king. Adding to his trouble, Álvaro II faced a direct challenge from within his own family. His half-brother, with the backing of the sister, raised an army to overthrow him and seize the throne. Álvaro II had to turn to the people of the city, and with a captivating speech, he was able to rally them into battle to defend the city. After some fighting, they both agreed to single combat, with Álvaro coming out victorious. Moving our attention towards Soyo, where the Mawene of Congo, a position that had been exclusively held by the Da Silva branch of the royal family since the 15th century, swore absolute loyalty to Álvaro, only to join the rebellion in 1592, which caused massive depopulation of various parts of the kingdom. To maintain stability, Álvaro was forced to grant a royal pardon to the Mawena of Soyo and cede control of Soyo's taxes and also recognize Soyo as a voting province of Congo. During this period of civil wars and internal conflict, Congo was largely sidelined from the region's politics, which had become increasingly tense since the Battle of the Congo River in 1580, a battle that had given Paulo the breathing room he needed to strengthen his position in Ndongo. He used the time to build a network of forts along the Kawaza River, including one at Masagono. This allowed Portuguese troops and merchants to move and resupply quickly into the interior. Paulo also managed to convince many local leaders and sobas around the Kawaza River, as well as the regions of Ilamba and Kasama, to pledge loyalty to Portugal. As Paulo's power in the south of Ndongo grew, more sobas swore loyalty to Portugal, which irritated Titumbo, the king of Ndongo, who raised an army that was said to have stretched as far as 7 kilometers long. That's 4.3 miles in freedom units for you Americans, which is most of you, so you know what, forget what I said. In response, Paulo assembled an army of 120 musketeers and 8,000 infantry troops that were supplied by the Sobas, making this the biggest Portuguese force the region had seen. On August 24, 1585, Paulo's forces engaged in Ndongo's army in battle, which resulted in a decisive victory for Paulo. The two forces clashed again in 1584, with the same outcome solidifying Paulo's status as the de facto ruler of the eastern region of Ndongo. All that remained for Paulo to fulfill his royal charter was to invade Ndongo's heartland and conquer its capital. It took 2 years of meticulous preparation. The invasion force was ready like a fine-tuned, well-oiled machine. All for Paulo's days de Novaris to die on the 9th of April 1585. A year later, the Portuguese crown would revoke Paulo's royal charter and rename the colony to the Kingdom of Angola, which was to be ruled by a royally appointed governor for a limited term. Before any of this could happen, Luis Serraro, Paulo's lieutenant, took command of the colony and launched the invasion of Ndongo in December of 1589 with a force of 15,000 archers and 128 Portuguese musketeers. They swiftly advanced towards Ndongo's capital, where they found it to be completely deserted. What they did not know was that the kingdom of Matamba had broken off from Congo around 1560 and was now an ally of Ndongo. So on the 29th of December, Mantamba's and Ndongo's forces were able to creep up on a completely disorganized Angolan army, launching a surprise attack that threw the entire battlefield into pandemonium. The Portuguese contingent of the Angolan army was able to retreat, with only a few making it back to the fort at Masangono. This defeat saw Paulo's entire life's work go up in flame. Most of the Nlamba Sobas deflected back to Ndongo, with their forces, which were once part of the Portuguese invasion army, now rained arrows on the Portuguese ships on the Kalanza River. Angola was reduced to a few ports and soba in a territory that was still technically Congo. The result of the war shook the Portuguese crown so much that a royal decree was passed, instructing Angola to keep peace with the major powers in the region. The colony was also told to source for slaves through less destructive methods, and with the Portuguese and Spanish crown united by 1580, this opened a new market to the wider Spanish-American colonies that accelerated demand in the transatlantic slave trade. The Kingdom of Angola and Portugal itself had nothing of what to trade for slaves, and had to participate in the local economy, particularly the luxury textile trade, to generate revenue to buy slaves. Textiles were procured in the northern regions of Congo and transported down to regions like Ndongo for a fair fee. These textiles themselves were so valuable that they were used as a sort of currency. As this trade grew, Congo began establishing customs stations to tax the Portuguese who always tried to evade them. The Portuguese fortune didn't improve as the Dutch arrived in Soyo in 1593 and established trade agreements with Congo. The Dutch, longtime rivals of the Portuguese, created fierce competition in a region where the Portuguese were already struggling to secure slaves. The increased competition from the Dutch made the governors of Angola, who served limited terms, less inclined to follow royal decrees, as there were no real consequence for ignoring them. To meet the growing demands for slaves, they waged costly wars against Ndongo and some of Congo's territories to generate slaves in the process. This conflict claimed the lives of thousands of local fighters, most of whom were enslaved individuals forced into battle. Despite the heavy toll, the Portuguese slavers profited greatly, with slave exports from Angola soaring to 5,000 per year. This was risky for Angola, but the timing couldn't have been better, as Ndongo and Congo were preoccupied. For Ndongo, Quilombo died around 1592, leaving his son, Mbande, in charge of a kingdom that was deeply divided and resistant to his rule. Facing so many opponents, Mbande sought a peace treaty with Angola in 1599, hoping to redirect the focus towards the Sobas that opposed him. By the end of the 16th century, Angola was no longer a serious threat to Congo or Ndongo. Even some Sobas of Ndongo were able to repel Portuguese attacks. However, this was about to change, as a new power was emerging in the highlands of Central Africa. To the south of Angola in the highlands of Central Africa lay the Kingdom of Benguela. The kingdom had initially contacted Polo for help against the Mbangala, which were allegedly a raiding horde that practiced cannibalism and killed their young. They were possibly born from the expansion wars of Benguela. Polo never got back to them because, he died. In 1614, the Portuguese crown gave Cavara Pereira a royal charter to conquer and colonize Benguela. When Pereira arrived the kingdom in 1617, he was shocked to discover that the kingdom was in ruins, ravaged by the Mbangala. Pereira established a town along the Cantubele River and began trading with the local Sobas. As Pereira grew wealthy and more powerful, he attacked, looted, and destroyed the Kangombes Mbangala's faction that threatened the area. This victory made Pereira a force to be reckoned with, and the Sobas began to swear vassalage to him in exchange for protection from the Mbangala, effectively establishing the colony of Benguela. Coming back to Angola, where Luis de Mendes Vasconcelos resumed office as governor in 1617. It was repulsed by the established use of locals in the Angolan army, even touted that if given a
pure Portuguese army, and I would conquer all of Africa up to the Indian Ocean.
That's what he stood on until the Mbangala band crossed the Kawanza River and pillaged Alixa Mambaza and Kafusi Kamambari to rubble. The force the Mbangala displayed made Vasconcelos change his mind and seek out an alliance with them to take on Ndongo. Moving to Ndongo, the unpopular king Mbande of Ndongo had been brutally assassinated in 1614. His son Mbande II was so paranoid that he had his stepbrother, stepsister, and all his uncles killed to secure the throne. This infighting was the perfect opportunity for Vasconcelos to launch an attack with his Mbangala allies, as the Sobas who were against Mbande II allowed Angola's forces right through, and his two capitals were pillaged, with Mbande II having to flee the kingdom. Angola returned to attack Ndongo in 1619, this time forcing Mbande II to flee to the Kingdonga highlands on the Kawanza River. With Ndongo left without a leader, the Portuguese tried installing a puppet who nobody listened to as Mbande II was still alive. The Mbangala were also becoming a problem as all they cared about was pillaging. The sheer scale of destruction unleashed on Ndongo and Intamba created a humanitarian crisis in the region. Thousands of refugees fled to the Kingdonga Highlands, where Mbande II had established a safe haven and stronghold to resist the Portuguese invasion. The Portuguese slavers, however, couldn't have been more happier as they followed the trail of destruction, buying slaves of the Mbangala as they pillaged their way through Ndongo and Matamba. During Mendes' brief 4-year rule, approximately 50,000 people were sold off as slaves from Angola's port. To put things into context, Angola was only supplying 50% of the transatlantic slave trade before the 1600s, a number that had risen up to 75% by 1620 and almost 90% by the end of the 17th century. The governors of Angola viewed the slave trade as an easy way to get rich. New governors simply picked off where the old ones left, and some, like Mendes, even maintained private armies that continued to pillage and raid vulnerable villages long after they had left office. Mendes was replaced in 1620 with Correia de Sal. Seeing this as an opportunity for a fresh start, Mbande II of Ndongo sent his sisters, Tambo, Fungi, and Njinga to negotiate peace with the new governor. Nzinga, who led the delegation, was told to sit on a mat before the governor, but she refused, using one of her attending maids as a stool instead. She successfully negotiated the release of thousands of Ndongo's peasants to re-establish the kingdom and secured a promise from the Sao to help drive out the Mbangala. However, the Salsa failed or never intended to keep his promise to resolve the crisis the Portuguese had caused in the region. This failure drove Mbande II into a deep depression, leading to his tragic suicide in 1624. But if you believe some stories, he was poisoned. Despite this tragedy, this event created an opportunity for Njinga to rise to power and become the Queen of Ndongo. However, like the kings before her, she faced rejection from the kingdom after a series of events that we're not going to go into, at least in this video. and was forced to flee the kingdom. With Njinga's exile, Portugal effectively claimed victory in its nearly 100-year war against Ndongo. Confident in their success, they turned their attention to Congo, which was already struggling with its own political crisis. Álvaro II of Congo had meticulously laid out a plan with the Vatican for his son to succeed him, but this son died in 1610. And with no heir and death knocking on his door, Álvaro II will appoint the Duke of Soyo as a royal executor to decide who would be the next king. After Álvaro's death in 1614, the Duke appointed Bernardo II, Álvaro II's brother, as king, only to have him deposed a year later in favor of Álvaro's 20-year-old son, Álvaro III, who immediately had his uncle executed and left his body outside a church where he sought refuge. The Duke of Nzinga, one of Álvaro III's uncle, found this act to be barbaric and disgusting and led a rebellion against him. However, this rebellion was quickly crushed and it emboldened Álvaro III. This shift in power alarmed other nobles, prompting them to launch a larger rebellion that was led by the Duke of Soyo. Despite the uprising, Álvaro III successfully negotiated peace by granting full amnesty and pardons to the rebellious nobles. The Duke of Soyo died in 1620, and Álvaro III wanted revenge against the late Duke, invading Soyo and executed the heir of the Da Silva throne. Álvaro, thinking that he had now secured the throne and there was nobody left to oppose him, was shocked when his brother deposed the Duke of Mpangu and declared war against the province. To add to his trouble, the Sausa, who was the governor of Angola, launched an invasion into Kansanze, a region that had long been a refuge for those fleeing slavery and Angola's war with Ndongo. The following year, the Sao accused Pedro Afonso, the newly appointed Duke of Mbamba, of aiding Kansanze during the invasion and demanding that Álvaro III depose and execute Pedro Afonso. With crisis brewing across the kingdom and the looming threat of an Angolan army at his border, Álvaro III, at the unripe age of 27, passed away. This left the kingdom on the brink of disaster as the Sausa eagerly waited for the chance to sponsor a new candidate to ensure that Congo, in its usual fashion, descended into a civil war. So he waited and waited. However, instead of chaos, Congo managed to pull itself together and elected Pedro Afonso, the very man the Sausa wanted dead, as Pedro II, ushering in a new dynasty. As you can imagine, this infuriated the Sausa, who vowed to see the king in chains. He launched a surprise incursion with a force 3,000 strong, penetrating deep into Mbamba undetected. The Duke of Mbamba, who was caught off guard, fled to rally reinforcements from the Duke of Mbambi to face the Sausa's forces. On December 18, 1622, the battlefield was set. The Duke of Mbamba, having just returned from what would be his last mass and confession, knew he had to buy the Congolese royal army enough time to respond to the Sausa's threat. He and the Duke of Mbambi lined up their forces. The Portuguese invoked Saint Santiago, and the Congolese did the same, declaring, "If your saint is white, ours is black." The battle commenced, with Mbamba's initial attack disrupting the Angola's archers, but the combined forces of Mbamba and Mbambi were overwhelmed by the sheer number of Angola's army. With this decisive victory, the Sausa was confident that he could take all of Congo, pushing his army further into Mbamba, where they met and were utterly destroyed by the Congolese royal army. I mean, what do you think would have happened? Just as in 1589, when Luis Serraro was defeated, the Portuguese colony was once again up in flames. Congo swiftly closed its border and trade routes to the Portuguese settlers in Angola, which caused protests to break out against the Sausa in Dundana as his war had cost them investments worth 80,000 cruzados, which I didn't find any exchange rate, but we could imagine that it was quite a lot. With Congo now on the offensive, Pedro II moved his forces to reclaim the lost vassals and territories, determined to drive out the Portuguese out of Angola once and for all. He demanded that Angola honor its agreement with Njinga and sought to form a sort of regional alliance against Portugal. Pedro II even reached out to the Dutch, who were locked in the Dutch-Portuguese war against the Iberian Union. The Dutch, seeing an opportunity to disrupt the Portuguese, were receptive to Pedro's plan and included Angola in their broader strategy to invade Brazil. But an overzealous Dutch fleet led by Pétion was sent for reconnaissance and launched a fairly devastating but ultimately unsuccessful attack on Ludana and retreated to Soyo, where he discovered that Pedro II had died. And you know what this means for Congo? The invasion of Angola was called off. Pedro II's son, Gracia I, was quickly sworn in as king, which was opposed by factions of the royal family challenging his legitimacy, claiming that his father had only been accepted as king due to Congo's delicate position at the time. Civil war once again loomed. But this time the matrons intervened, ousting Gracia I in favor of Ambriso I. Ambrosio I, however, was a paranoid and untrusting king. He exiled the Duke of Nzinga, who had helped House Gracia I, a move that destabilized his reign, which was already so repressive that he was killed in an uprising in 1631. His son, Álvaro IV, succeeded him, but Congo. An uncle raised an army to depose the young king. Luckily for Álvaro IV, he was saved by two powerful figures, Álvaro Njinga and Gracia Nimi. As a reward, they were appointed the Duke of Mbamba and the Marquis of Kuvia. Álvaro IV would die shortly after doing this. The crown then went to another Álvaro V, another son of Pedro II, who, in a bid to secure the throne, targeted very men who defended his brother. Álvaro V was eventually killed in battle, with Álvaro Njinga, who in 1636 crowned himself king as Álvaro VI. His reign began with numerous revolts that saw him being captured by the Duke of Soyo, who only released him after granting more land successions to Soyo. Around this time, the Dutch had been raiding Portuguese slave ships off the coast of Dodana to feed the labor demands of the sugar plantations in Brazil that had been captured from the Portuguese by the WIC, the Dutch West Indian Company. But they needed a more permanent supply. The Dutch in 1639 sent emissaries to re-establish contact with Congo. Álvaro VI rejected them because he was using Portuguese mercenaries to fight his war with Soyo. Luckily for them, Gracia Nimi, who had become the Duke of Mbamba, wrote to the WIC in 1640 saying,
God makes me become king, as I hope I will soon, as I am the closest inheritor of the crown. I will look to attack the Portuguese, as here in Mbamba I suffer great trouble from them.
Magically, Álvaro VI would pass away in what is suspected to be poison in February of 1641, with his brother swooping in and crowning himself as Gracia II. Not wanting to continue his brother's costly war with Soyo, who had just restored his exiled heir, Gracia II turned his attention to his Dutch friends and wrote, and I quote,
Manda Armada.
On the 26th of August of 1641, a large Dutch fleet made landfall and immediately opened fire on the Portuguese port in Luanda. They, along with the Congolese force, pushed the Portuguese all the way back to the Ndongo ally. Seeing the table turn in her favor, Queen Njinga made a return to lay claim to all of Angola and Ndongo. As the region lined up for the showdown between Queen Njinga, the Portuguese and the Ndongo proxy king, the Dutch pulled out of their alliance with Congo, as they had already achieved their main objective to secure a port along the coast from where they could source for slaves. This caused Gracia II to withdraw the Congolese troops back to the kingdom to deal with his domestic issues with Soyo. By 1646, Queen Njinga, at the age of 65, had to face the Portuguese in battle at Kanvanga. She entered the battle with confidence, having defeated them 2 years earlier. At first, Njinga's forces were successful, breaking through the Portuguese line with ease. However, they stopped to loot the Portuguese supply lines, which gave the Portuguese a chance to regroup. Seizing the opportunity, the Portuguese launched a counterattack to deal a crushing defeat to Njinga's army, forcing them to retreat. Njinga's defeat at Kanvanga drew the Dutch and King Gracia II to rejoin the war against the Portuguese. Gracia was also fighting his own war against Soyo, but wanted the Portuguese out so bad that he sent part of his army to join Njinga's troop. With this help, Njinga achieved a major victory over the Portuguese in 1647 and repeated her success in 1548. This defeat severely weakened the Portuguese army, forcing them to retreat and take refuge in the forts at Ambaka and Muxima. Nzinga began a siege on Portuguese forts with Dutch artillery, raining a barrage of unending cannonballs to tear down the forts as they did not yield to the immense firepower. The Portuguese sent for backup, which arrived under the command of Salvador Correia de Sarre Benavides on the 21st of August 1648, a month into Nzinga's siege. The Dutch gave up the port and surrendered without putting a fight. Queen Njinga had to withdraw her forces as she wasn't prepared for the South. Many of the residents and locals around the fort considered the survival a miracle of the Virgin Mary, with only pilgrimages and celebrations held annually till this day. The Sao, knowing it to have been a fool's errand to try to take on Congo, Ndongo or Queen Njinga in Mantamba, opted to raid and pillage vulnerable villages and minor states in the region, enslaving many of the inhabitants to cheaply supply his plantation back in Brazil. These wars were just like the ones the Salsa waged about a decade before, destructive, bringing great suffering to everyone who survived the war. Njinga began to reflect on her legacy and the future of the kingdom she had fought so hard to build. Her rule was far from being uncontested, with constant challenges to her legitimacy coming from Felipe Ari Ha Ngola, the ruler of Impungu Ha Ndongo. the other half of the divided Ndongo kingdom. Surrounded by enemies, she faced relentless opposition even as she sought to secure her place in history. Njinga sought to address these challenges by setting in motion an elaborate plan. She converted to Catholicism and ultimately made peace with the Portuguese by becoming their vassal, which in turn secured the recognition of her right to rule her half of Ndongo. At the same time, she observed the growing ambition of the Mbangala within her army, who believed that one of them should inherit the kingdom after Nzinga. To counter this threat, Nzinga named her sister Ahe, aiming to protect her legacy and prevent the Mbangala from taking over the kingdom, as she feared that they would impose their customs and traditions on the kingdom. On December 17, 1663, Queen Njinga of Ndongo and Matamba, the goddess who had shaped our world since birth, passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 80. Her death reverberated across the region, prompting ceremonies from both friends and foes. Those who loved her mourned her deeply, unable to imagine fighting without her, and her enemies rejoiced, relieved that they would no longer have to face her formidable strength in battle. Njinga's sister, Donna Barbara, would be crowned the next queen of Ndongo and Matamba. Still, just as Njinga had feared, Barbara, suspected to have been poisoned, died a few short years into her reign, with Njinga Mona, who was the leader of the Mbangala faction, taking charge of the kingdom. This immediately led to a civil war with the legitimist Christian faction led by João Gutierrez Ngola Kanini, Barbara's husband, successfully pushing Mona out of the capital. João was crowned king of Ndongo and Matamba in 1669, but died a few years later, which allowed Mona to return and forced João's heir, Luis Gutierrez, into exile. While Luis ran to the Portuguese for help, Antonio, leader of the royal faction, was able to defeat Mona, allowing Luis to return and be crowned king in 1671 as Francisco I of Ndongo. Although Njinga's plans to secure the Portuguese recognition of her rule succeeded, he didn't win over Felipe I. After his son João II became king in 1664 of the second half of Ndongo, he set out to reunite all of Ndongo under his rule. João II disrupted Portuguese trade by building fortresses and placing soldiers along key trade routes. He also laid claim to Ndongo's territories controlled by Portuguese Angola. With the army tied up in Congo, the Portuguese couldn't respond to João II directly. They funded the local allies to raid Mpangu Angola in an effort to disrupt João II. Unfortunately for João II, Portuguese troops eventually were able to respond to his threat, as they were able to break through his blockade and his forces were quickly defeated. With no means to fend off the Portuguese, João fled from Ndongo, marking an end to Ndongo Mpungu's independence as it was absorbed into Angola. Congo was not immune to the region's political instability, as it found itself deep in political crisis after the collapse of its three-way alliance with Queen Njinga and the Dutch. Gracia II struggled to deal with the growing pressure from Soyo, which was ruled by Daniel da Silva, who had become a major threat by forming strong alliances with dukes from other provinces. This alliance openly opposed Gracia II, accusing him of being a usurper and unworthy of the throne. Despite his efforts, Gracia II was unable to defeat da Silva and his powerful alliance. The kingdom was once again in need of the matrons to weigh in on a matter of legitimacy, a matter Gracia II knew he was going to lose. Using a fire that had mysteriously broken out in the palace as evidence of a sinister plot conceived by Soyo and the matrons, Gracia II had some of the matrons executed and others subjected to prison conditions so bad that it would kill them, effectively disbanding the matrons. Gracia II attempted another invasion of Soyo in 1655, depleting his army in the process. He turned to the Portuguese to replenish his forces by purchasing slaves and hiring mercenaries and soldiers for a renewed attack on Soyo. When the Portuguese realized why Gracia was assembling these forces, they entered a secret plan with Soyo to help dethrone Gracia II and allow the kingdom to elect a new king, who the Portuguese plan would be their own puppet on the Congolese throne. Gracia II was able to uncover and thwart the plot just in time. Despite the failure of the scheme with Soyo, the Portuguese, determined to press forward, marched the army towards Congo. When their troops got to the Luze River and stories of the last Portuguese army that ventured this far into Congo began to spread, they revolted in fear as the Portuguese invasion into Congo crumbled. Gracia II spent the rest of his reign in a stalemate with Daniel da Silva of Soyo, dying in 1660 with Antonio I succeeding him. Antonio's first order of business as king was to defend Congo's claim over the Dembos, where Queen Njinga and Gracia II had clashed in battle numerous times over the kingdom. Even the Portuguese in Angola had interest in the Dembos as it was an important trading hub. Antonio I mobilized his army into the Dembos to secure Congo's claim. Portugal and Angola, also wanting to lay claim to Dembos, also mobilized its army as the two forces will meet in Mbawila in 1665, where a major battle would commence. The battle was fiercely contested, but the Congolese forces were already exhausted from the long march they had to make. During the course of the battle, Antonio I was wounded by Portuguese musket fire and eventually died. While the Congolese retreated in defeat, Portugal sank all the way back to Luanda with Antonio's head on a pike. Congo's loss at the Battle of Mbawila had disastrous consequences for the kingdom. Not only did the king get killed, he had no heir to take over, which meant the throne was up for grab for anybody who could keep it. The Kinlanza house, which had produced the last three unelected king, had a power struggle between three contenders. Alfonso II became king but was deposed a month later by Álvaro VII, who had already eliminated the third candidate. Even in exile, Alfonso II continued to claim the title of King of Congo while ruling the breakaway kingdom of Nkondo. So who did not want to see someone from the Kinlaza house that had terrorized them for the last 28 years, marched an army into South Salvador in 1666, deposing Álvaro VII and installing Álvaro VIII from the Kimpanzu house. Álvaro VIII was overthrown just 3 years into his reign by Pedro III. In response, Soyo once again marched into the capital to remove Pedro III. Pedro fled to his fortress in Humbala, where he continued to claim the title King of Congo. Álvaro IX was then installed king, only for Pedro III to come back again to replace him with Rafael I. Oh, a new name. This pushed Soyo to intervene once again, forcing Rafael to flee to Angola to seek help reclaiming the throne. The Portuguese, together with Rafael's troops, organized an army and naval fleet to confront Soyo. The forces first clashed in the Battle of Mbamba, where Paulo II of Soyo was killed. With Rafael back on the throne, the Portuguese felt they could take Congo for themselves. It was up for grabs. This time, Soyo was led by Esteva II da Silva. Both forces clashed at Kitombo on the 18th of October 1670. What the Portuguese did not know was that Kitombo was Soyo's playground, where their ancestors had never lost a battle. The Portuguese forces were utterly and totally annihilated. From this point, Soyo's influence in the region expanded rapidly as it was able to capture so much artillery from the Battle of Kitombo, which it was able to expand by trading with the Dutch, the French, and always finding themselves everywhere, the English. To be clear, they were trading slaves. As Soyo began to flourish, Congo's power and influence began to fall as it was locked in a continuous cycle of civil wars. Numerous cities, especially the capital, had been massively depopulated as their inhabitants had to flee war to avoid death or worse, slavers. By 1678, Pedro III, who fled to Umbala, remember him? Well, he came back with an army to destroy his once not so beloved city. Everything that was living was either killed or captured to be sold off as slaves, leaving the city to be taken over by wild elephants who trampled the city to rubble. After 13 years of interregnum, the Kingdom of Congo as a unified political entity was practically dead. Its former regions became politically independent, forming into rival kingdoms whose rulers came to be the one true king of Congo. Reunification of the kingdom was further complicated by the rise of the Lunda Empire, whose rapid expansion disrupted the politics of Central West Africa. This doesn't mean there wasn't any attempt to reunify the kingdom. Pedro IV of the Agua House, which I would just call the ARH, who ruled the Kimbangu region, tried to reoccupy the capital city in 1694, but was forced to retreat due to threats from Jao II, who was another claimant to the throne. Pedro IV changed his strategy for retaking the city. Instead of a direct assault, he focused on gradually building and expanding a colony that would both occupy and defend the city over time. Others like Hannah Afonso de Leon, the sister of Gracia II, who ruled over Nkondo and was a matron of the Kiliza house, had her own plans to unify the kingdom under her preferred claimant, Jao II. She tried the diplomatic approach by organizing a concert of Congo, which didn't get enough support from the royal houses. Growing frustrated, she then went for the military approach by conquering other provinces to rebuild the kingdom by force under her leadership. Ordinary citizens too had grown tired of the chaotic state of the kingdom. War, famine, and pestilence ravaged the lands they once called home. Thousands upon thousands of people had been trafficked to the Americas due to slave trade. Massive cities once populated laid empty as refugees camps kept sprouting across the kingdom, and that's not even accounting for the stress of an expanding empire at the doorstep. The people of Congo had had enough, and they wanted it all to end. Amongst the colonies of Pedro IV grew a social-religious movement, that's a cool way to say cult, around 1701. Their leader, Beatrice Kimpa Vita, claimed to be the reincarnation of Saint Antonio, the Catholic patron saint of lost sins, and for the people of Congo, that was their kingdom. The influence of the Antonian movement quickly spread across the kingdom, as thousands were drawn to her teachings. Central to her message was the belief in a divine mandate for the true king of Congo to reclaim the capital. She approached both Pedro IV and Giles II with her vision, but both rulers rejected her. Unable to win anybody over, Beatrice, with the help of Juan Pedro Constantino da Silva, who was a general in Pedro IV's army, reoccupied the capital city with her followers. From here, she continued to spread her anti-war message, which left room for a more syncretic interpretation of Christianity and criticized the Capuchin missionaries that had dominated the Soyo royal court and Congo's politics. As you can imagine, Beatrice's teaching brought her enemies in the Capuchin missionaries and Pedro IV, who had her captured and tried for heresy and witchcraft, eventually having her tied to a stake and burnt. 3 years later, Pedro IV's army would march into the capital city to lay claim to the throne. Pedro IV believed that Congo was being held back by his focus on the past and proposed a new founding story. In his version, Congo was established by a blacksmith who rose to power because he was seen as a wise judge, rather than the warrior king Lukeni Liu Nimini was. Pedro also introduced the idea of power rotation among the rival royal houses to reduce conflict. While his proposal was accepted, it was met with a great deal of skepticism. When Pedro IV did die in 1721, there was a peaceful transition to Manuela II for a little while till the Kinlaza house waged a very bloody war that lasted till 1732. After which, Manuela II had a relatively peaceful reign for 23 years. The efforts of Congo's king since Pedro IV to save the kingdom were ultimately in vain. By the early 1760s, the kingdom had become too decentralized, spiraling into a series of wars that gave rise to the so-called bandit nobles. These nobles acted more like ancient leaders of West Central Africa, raiding and kidnapping travelers to sell as slaves. The church raised concerns, of course not out of moral outrage, but because of many of these captives were being sold to the evil Protestants in North America instead of the good Catholics in South America. Ironically, these bandit nobles mirrored the ambitions of the leaders of Central West Africa, expanding their territories through violence which fueled the slave trade. By 1803, under Gracia V, Congo was so diminished that the king had to make a request to the governor of Angola to please send priests to crown him king. This marked a new low, as some of these same bandit nobles began to ascend the throne. By the mid-19th century, Congo was little more than a cultural memory in the minds of the Bali-Congo people. The global demands for slaves declined in the 1850s as European steamships brought manufactured goods to Congo, undermining the local industries. As resources dwindled and Congo's ability to adapt fell short, the kingdom would fade into irrelevancy. But still, the story of Congo is not merely one of decline. It's a testament to resilience, transformation, and the enduring struggle for identity in a rapidly changing world. Whether the legacy of Congo truly ended or simply took a new form is a question for another time. Hey everyone, Bamshe here. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, please drop a like, share, and leave a comment. It really helps the video and helps grow the channel. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I know it's been a while since there has been any activity here, but that's going to change this year. I promise. A huge shout out to my amazing patrons. You guys truly help keep this channel alive. If you would like to join them, there are other perks. You get your name on the screen, you get early access to videos, exclusive content, and other things that I'm working on. Also, big thanks to everyone who lent their voices and their time to this video. I am very, very much appreciative of you guys, and thank you once again. Until next time, which will be a year from now, I promise, I'm Bamishe.